Welcome to the Marshall Pruett Podcast and our Week in IndyCar series, brought to you by Cooper Tires, the Justice Brothers, TorontoMotorsports.com, and Bell Racing Helmets USA. Our guests for this episode, Team Penske President Tim Cindric, making his very first appearance on this show. Had him on the podcast more than once for other things, but really happy to have Tim here, knowing he's got two drivers, two of the three, that have the strongest likelihood of winning the championship this weekend in Monterey. Certainly his domain, and his driver in particular that he looks over for strategy, Joseph Newgarden, leading the championship. So some fun questions for Tim. Went into a bit of overtime, thanks to Tim, more than an hour that we discussed all manner of great things, all driven by your Q&A. That's our format for the Week in IndyCar. So thank you for tons of great stuff that came in via Twitter, with my @MarshallPruett handle, on Facebook with the Marshall Pruett Podcast Facebook page, and also via Reddit and the Reddit IndyCar community. So thanks again for sending in all of the great stuff there. Normally do a little bit of a preamble here, and I'm actually just going to get us going in just a moment into our guest with Tim, and then follow with my man, my good friend, Anders Krohn, who has been a veteran member of the NBC Sports Road to Indy broadcast team. Also probably know his voice from the IndyCar radio enterprise. So with Anders, we're looking at here to close this show, talking about all the Road to Indy Championship scenarios heading into Monterey, WeatherTech Raceway, Laguna Seca. 3 tiers, of course, championships to be set in all 3: USF 2000, Indy Pro 2000, and Indy Lights. So fun conversation as usual with Anders. That'll close things off here. And then we have our Q&A that you've sent in for me. Altogether between the 3 social media destinations, I think we had 90-ish questions come in this week. And many of them you've sent my way, so I'm going to get to those, as we've been doing of late in a separate episode just dedicated to your Q&A. Plenty of awesome stuff there. Last little note before we get going. If you're going to be headed to Monterey this weekend, hope to see you at one, if not both, of my final live shows of the year on Friday at 5 p.m. on the second floor of the old Media Center, the one at the very top of pit lane, closest to the walkover bridge. Guess you would say on driver's left on pit lane at the top there. Going to be having a rookie graduation ceremony. That's not a real graduation ceremony, but going to have all 4 of our full-time IndyCar rookies, Marcus Ericsson, Felix Rosenquist, Colton Herta, and Santino Ferrucci, for about a half hour, 45 minutes. Truly a standing room only type of deal. The room fits maybe 30 people, maybe 40. I'm not exactly sure. We'll have a couple of chairs, but if you're going to come, bring a folding chair, bring a blanket or something to sit on. This is just meant to be more of like a cafe style setting. More of an old MTV Unplugged acoustic type setup, where just a really small group. Honestly, it's more like a bunch of friends talking about racing. And as we had last weekend, where we did one with 3 IMSA drivers, it's not a super formal thing. Just in breaks of the conversation, folks are asking questions. Wasn't even raise your hand if you have a question. Just truly fun to have a small room, small group, and just talk about racing, in this case, with some rookies who we firmly believe are going to be champions in the future, Indy 500 winners, and help carry the sport forward as some of its veterans look to retire. Then on Saturday at 4:15 in the infield, that being the dry lake, the little mini lake area there between turn 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the infield, on the Cooper Tires stage right in the IndyCar fan zone. Gonna have the final live MP podcast of the year, and I'm really stoked. It's not as if anyone's, quote, the lead guest, but the fact that we're going to have Robert Wickens there, I just think that's a really special thing. And thanks to Robbie, we've been trying to do something like this for a little while. And when he reached out a couple months ago and said, hey, why don't we plan on doing something towards the end of the year? Obviously, Robbie hasn't been hidden. You can certainly find him in the paddock or on pit lane, but I think this is going to be one of a very few things he's done, kind of a public format like this. So really thankful that we're going to have Robbie there. We're going to have Brian Herta there, talk about the pass and a few other things. A couple of his wins here, big wins at Laguna Seca in the past. We will also have the French fry to my hamburger, Sebastian Bourdais. Really looking forward to having him. And then a little bit after 4:15, he's got a team meeting, so he's not going to be there right at the start, but we will have championship leader Joseph Newgarden swinging by for 15, 20 minutes or so. Do a normal show, have some fun, make fun of one another, crack a few jokes, hopefully have a few questions come in from you all in the crowd. Might sound silly to say it, but some folks do ask. These are free. Come on in, have fun, all courtesy of Cooper Tires, the Justice Brothers, Toronto Motorsports, and Bell Racing Helmets USA. So that's what we got going. I got one other thing I'll mention, and I'm a little, hesitant to manage it because the thing has fallen through about 20 times in terms of scheduling. Assuming everything finally works as planned, on Friday, I will also be sitting down with some good friends, that being Dario Franchitti, Tony Kanaan, Max Pappas, Paul Tracy will also be there as we gather some thoughts, memories, share some tales about the late and great Greg Moore, knowing that here at the end of October, we will be coming up to that 20-year anniversary of his loss. So ahead of that, wanted to sit down with some of his closest friends, teammates, just those who really knew him better than most, and help bring him to today. For those who maybe know the name, read a little bit about him, heard some stories, but really to honor Greg, just thought it might be cool to have some of his best friends be the conduit to help gain deeper appreciation for him in the modern era. Maybe for some of you who've become a fan of IndyCar after Greg's unfortunate loss at Fontana in 1999. So looking forward to that. Also working on, it's not totally done, but 3 out of the 4 folks have said they'll do it. Knowing that at Laguna Seca in 1991 was really the biggest and most famous episode of the Marlboro Challenge. Just a crazy, it's almost a all-star race, you could say. One that was won by Michael Andretti in 91, and there were certainly other Marlboro Challenge races prior to 91 at Laguna, but wanted to sit down with Michael Andretti, the person I guess you could say, stole the win from, Rick Mears, Bobby Rahal, and I'm hoping Crazy Art and Lyondike can join us as well. So that would be another post-season little feature of some form. So working on that too. So trying to get not only this IndyCar season finale covered properly, also trying to make best use of the time with everyone gathered in one space to try and put together a couple of things for the off season as well. All right, with all that said, let's get going with our man Tim Cindric. He, leader of Team Penske from a president standpoint, obviously the big man himself, RP Roger Penske, is the boss of bosses, but he entrusts Tim to run the entire organization full-time on his behalf. Then when we're starting to get done, you'll hear a little bit of music fade in. That'll mean we are transitioning out of that interview into Anders Krohn and our conversation about the Road to Indy finales this weekend. Then there'll be another fade with music, which means we're done with the episode. And then hopefully you can roll right through and click on and listen to the awesome Q&A that you all sent in for me here on the Marshall Pruett podcast and our Week in IndyCar episode, the final one of the active season. And for those who asked, don't worry, the show doesn't stop just because the season stops. Just means this is the last one of the year while the season's going. We'll be back next week, probably the very end of next week, since my wife and I are moving house on Wednesday, and I am spending Monday and Tuesday doing final packing and all kinds of craziness. Should have everything set up, basics at least, in the office, home office, by Thursday or Friday to do Week in IndyCar with our new champ, maybe? Who knows? We'll have to see who the guests might be. Don't know, but I'll look forward to speaking to you then. And off we go with Tim Cindric. It's a fairly exciting day here on the week in IndyCar. We have our very first Tim Cindric appearance. How are you, sir?
Hey, Marshall, I'm good. Good.
Well, we have a bunch of great questions here. Try to get cranking with the ones that had the most interest. Folks gave a lot of thumbs up to. So why don't we start off with Kevin Kemp, who says, Tim, will we ever see your son Austin in an IndyCar for the Indy 500 or any other IndyCar race? And I'll tell you, got a lot of questions about that, Tim, so clearly your boy's doing something right.
I guess we're starting off this session with my questions about my son. I guess he's at least people I guess have taken notice of the fact that he's racing, but yeah, good question. You know, I think number one, I never thought that I'd see my son, you know, driving race cars professionally or whatever else. But, you know, hats off to him, because I think, you know, from my standpoint, I think most of you heard me say before that it was never really my dream. I see a lot of fathers in the racing business, and sometimes I question if it's the father's dream or if it's the driver's dream to become, I guess, professional race car driver. And I can tell you 100% that it's his. And yeah, I guess what I'm most proud of is the work ethic that he's put into getting to the point that he has so far. You know, he's got to carry a bit of a burden, you know, being my son, but hopefully it flips at some point in time to where, you know, I'm his father or whatever else. So anyway, answer your question. I think fate will really determine that more than anything else. You know, it's not something that I really have my thumb on the scale for one way or the other. And I think if you ask Austin, you know, he's 100% into whatever he's doing at the time. So right now, I think driving an IndyCar is the furthest thing from his mind. But I think my favorite response to that question from him has always been, you know, my favorite car is the one with my name on it. So if you look at all the different types of cars that he's driven, you know, his goal has always been to differentiate himself, because that's what gives you the most opportunity is when you're prepared for any opportunity. So I think that's really what his strategy has been from the beginning.
I stopped counting at some point, Tim, and that's honest, just being honest here, between the Night Train USF 2000 car, between Rallycross, we had Continental Tire Series in there. I mean, I think monster trucks might be one of the few things left for him to race, but I also love the fact that RP seems to be appraising Austin in a truly independent manner. You know, it's not, we'll put the president's kid in one of our cars. He appears to be treating Austin as an individual and seeing value there. So that's something that I think is a pretty cool thing for him so far. Let's go to a question from David Truty. And this is one we've gotten, well, you've been asked this 1,000 times. I've asked it to you, but folks are curious about, I don't know if secession plan is the word, but at some point in time, we don't know if RP will step back and say, hey, you guys keep running this thing. I'm going to go to fewer races. Dave and a few others are just curious about a plan for, say, a post-full-time RP on the timing stand world. I assume such a thing is in place?
You know, Roger, I can honestly tell you, has never come out, and as far as I'm aware, told anybody about a secession plan. But all of us that are around him enough understand that he doesn't go through life without a plan. So, you know, I think the motto I've always had is that you have to trust who you work for. And, you know, otherwise you ought to keep looking. And, you know, Roger's always been somebody that, you know, has made really his businesses and everything else. He'll tell you over and over that the common thread, you know, throughout his businesses is racing. And he has 5 kids, and they all have a huge interest in motorsports, and they understand the legacy. They respect the legacy. And you know, I fully expect that, you know, there's no secret that he's 82 years old or whatever else. And he's, you know, he talks about how he's running out of birthdays as a fact. But, from the time that I went to work for him about 20 years ago now, he's got the same energy level, the same drive. And he's always said that there's too many people that count on him, you know, day to day, that he's never going to retire. and he's going to be at a racetrack as long as he can be there. So that's all I really need to hear, to be honest. And I fully believe that that there will be a racing world with a Penske name on it after Roger's gone.
Amen to that. Jerry Winters has a question centered directly on this weekend, knowing that of the 4 championship contenders for the IndyCar title, 3 of them being realistic contenders, 2 of them happen to be in your stable. Jerry says, Tim, how much time, if any, do you and the team spend on championship scenarios? Do you have a strategy for Joseph and Simon, say, to just stay out of trouble, or aim to be aggressive in controlling your own destiny, even if it's risky? He also says, good luck this weekend. So, great question. How do you go into this weekend and coach up your team, knowing that one up front, your driver, Mr. Newgarden, in theory, just needs to be good but stay out of trouble? Simon might need to mash the throttle a little bit, though, if he wants to be the champion.
Yeah, without a doubt. It's a good question, because I think you can overthink the scenarios. And, for us, first of all, either driver is a victory for us. So, the fact that it's one or the other, I think from our standpoint, it just needs to be one of. And I think the way that you approach that is it's a session by session approach in my mind. We start out with practice or testing, if you will, all day Thursday, and you kind of understand where you are, and you prepare yourself, all the way up until Saturday when you qualify. And I think after qualifying is really when you sit down and think about the various scenarios, because obviously track position is really important, especially at Laguna Seca. There's very few of these drivers that have actually raced an IndyCar at Laguna Seca, and none of them have raced a modern day or a current, IRL car or IndyCar as it exists today. So, I think it's, especially the fact that it's the first time we've been here. I think it's an open door, and I think there's a lot of drivers out there that have other things at stake besides the championship. There's a rookie of the year battle going on. There's pride amongst all the drivers. Some of them are trying to acquire their first win. Some of them are trying to be sure they finish the season off in the right way. So
some are trying to make sure they still have jobs.
It's well beyond the championship as far as what is happening, within the paddock. So, I think it's a session by session discussion as far as what's realistic and how do you approach it. But in IndyCar racing, anything can happen.
I guess one quick addition to that, and we hear fans curious about this as well. Our friend, Mr. Crazy Will Power, isn't in title contention this year, but we know whenever we go to a road course, he's always in contention for a pole and a win. We know he and the team would love to deliver Verizon another victory to close the season. Where does someone like Will, who we know can be a threat for the top step of the podium, factor into your pre-race planning in terms of helping? Or is that even something you can really, quote, ask a driver to do, knowing how competitive Will is just on his own?
Yeah, I think in other years it might be a little different, but going into the scenario that exists now, we're 2 hands in the air for Will sitting on the pole and winning the race, because anything that he can do to really take points away from Rossi is a success for us as a team. So I think his teammates are really his biggest fans right now. That should he win the race, it makes our scenario, I guess, a bit easier, if you want to call it that, but, opens up a few more scenarios.
I just love picturing him being stuffed because both Simon and Joseph are buying him double dinners each night. He's got 14 different Starbucks coffees waiting for him in the morning, just trying to, incentivize the help a little bit within the team.
That said, I think probably Simon's probably not sitting there paying the tab, because he's in a different boat than Joseph is relative to Will's fate this weekend. But as a team, when I made the last comment there, it was really as a team that our chances get better the higher he finishes.
Yeah, of course. Let's go to Greg Liversedge. He says, Tim, what's the best decision you haven't made? And he says, to put it another way, has there been a best choice or decision that you've, say, turned down, passed on maybe a driver that turned out not to be what you thought, or a manufacturer that might not have proven to be the right way to go, opt out of a program that ended up being a hot mess? And I know I wouldn't expect you to, quote, name names, but are there any scenarios where you look back and go, ooh, I'm glad we didn't go forward on that thing, because history has proven it might have been a fairly fraught experience?
That's a difficult one. You have to think back quite a bit on those things. And I think that, is there one in particular that comes to mind? Honestly, it's not a cop-out, probably not. Not that all decisions have been right or anything like that, but I think you have to maybe understand a bit more about how the decisions are made internally. That, Roger and I, we kick around a lot of different things every weekend. And, there's certain things that I'll bring up that he'll say, man, no way, or yeah, we ought to think about that, or vice versa. And it's ironic how often we come to the same conclusion. And really the best decisions are the most informed decisions. And you try and make those decisions as late as possible, which is sometimes inconvenient to a lot of those around you, but sometimes the best way to go about it. So, boy, I can't really tell you, a scenario that I could.
The Lotus, the Penske Lotus 2012 IndyCar program that never happened. Just kidding. Obviously, RP helped make.
There was a Penske in the Lotus world, so Jay ran the Lotus for us.
Fair point.
We didn't have to go down that route.
Yes, well, I guess we got a little bit of a sacrificial lamb there, but yes, the mothership obviously going with Ilmore with Chevy's return in 2012. Let's go to Ty Schlorer. Great question coming out of the WeatherTech Sports Car Championship weekend, where your team finished 1-2 overall with the Acura ARX-05s. Ty says, does any of the track data that's collected from, say, the IMSA program last weekend cannot apply to anything coming into the IndyCar weekend? He says, obviously the cars are worlds apart, but he says with both your team and Chip Ganassi having sports car programs, does it give you any slight advantage possibly going into the weekend? And if so, in what areas?
I think what comes to mind most is just the tire degradation.
Sure.
When you look at how the track, it was really, really hot relative to what you would expect there, especially on Friday last week. And when we tested here, it was 52 degrees, I think was the high. When we tested back at the beginning of the season. And it rained part of the day, and we really only got a couple hours of testing in, so didn't know what to expect from a tire degradation. Obviously, you're sitting there with Firestones and Michelins and different cars and that type of thing, but trends and overall tire behavior and really what the track temperature is relative to the ambient, I think that's what we'd focus on the most.
Interesting one. We got a couple of management style ones for which I'm really glad, because I don't know, and this is not me blowing smoke, I have an affinity for the work you do. Glad folks are just wanting to know more about management style, because obviously there's been a lot of success since you have been in charge there, Tim. This comes from Lance Snyder. He says, with an empire of potential Type A personalities ranging from drivers to engineers to crew, how hard is it, as I guess the senior most manager, to keep everyone focused on the bigger picture of moving the organization forward or to whatever endeavor Mr. Penske chooses? So, yeah, it's not as if you've got a bunch of lambs working for you, right? How do you navigate that? Because every, president, team manager, general manager has their own style. What's the Tim Cindric preferred method?
Well, I think it starts with the hiring process, in terms of the type of people and the type of culture you want to create or you want to have. And I think, like-minded people tend to attract the same types or the same culture or what have you. And I think the first thing to understand in any organization, Roger says his father taught him that from the beginning, that if a team wins, you win. And if you can try and go there with that mentality, but at the same time, it's a balance of that versus the competitiveness, because especially in a driver scenario, you want the hungry ones, you want the ones that are mad when they don't win. But helping them see the bigger picture. And, if you look at willpower, the shoes on the other foot this year relative to other years where team and vice versa. But I think my belief has always been, especially in this organization, watching Roger, from the time I was a little kid at Indianapolis, sitting in the grandstands behind his pit every other day. I've always believed that the stage is his. I've always believed that, it's our job to get something to the 7th or 8th inning and let him close what it is, whether it's, the deal, whether it's the conversation, or whether it's getting the trophy when he wants to. It's really his stage. I've been an owner of the IndyCar team from the very beginning, and it's never been really my goal to, put my name out there in a legal sense where it benefits the team. It's his team, it's his arena, and it's really up to us to deliver results for him.
Lance also asks, how'd you get roped into doing the show, and did you lose a bet? I love my listeners. They give me a hard time, which is look, I give people hard time. This is what I expect. So, yeah, I've got compromising photos of Tim, and we'll just leave it at that. It was a bad judgment day when I asked, and he said yes.
I'm not the one that, raises my hand, too often to volunteer, but, I'll certainly, I think whatever's good for the sport, I'm trying to be part of. So, anyway.
Greatly appreciated. Go to Jerry Sudduth, similar team-related question. He says, Tim, the Penske organization has a reputation that seems very much down to business. Its attitude seems to be one of little to no sense of fun. He says, however, everyone I've ever heard who works for the organization indicates that isn't so. And I try and tell folks as well. Some of the most colorful and enjoyable people I speak to in the IndyCar pit lane, IMSA as well, happen to be from your team. So Jerry says, what was your perception of Penske before you worked there, and how would you describe working for the team to an outsider, since you're now an insider?
Yeah, Penske, from the outside, when I look back at the 20-some years I looked at the organization, from the outside, professionalism is what you always looked at, the presentation, that type of thing. And for me, it's an organization where you have to take pride in what you do. You have to understand when to have fun with it and when not to. And I think Roger's the best example of that, because when you look at the fact that of all the people I've come across, he's probably one of the ones with the best sense of humor that honestly nobody really realizes, because it's very rare that you find him in that situation in which he's comfortable with who's around him and what the overall circumstances are to actually be able to show that sense of humor. But I think internally, most people you ask, and most of the drivers you see come and go, they from the outside it looks one way, and from the inside, hopefully you can't do this business as long as we do and not have any fun with it. So hopefully over time everybody starts to understand that it's not such a start shirt world, but it is part of what we do.
Yeah, the mindset part is the thing that clothes and polish and whatever doesn't necessarily reflect upon or dictate. Got two questions here, Tim, that are similar. One from Mike Stoops and the next from Carlos Villalobos. Mike says, Tim, assuming the next car in 2022 is a clean sheet design, he asks, what needs to be executed differently from the current DW12 to improve overall racing without losing the driver influence we currently see? Carlos asks something similar, says, if most consider the mid to late 90s kart era as the best of IndyCar, would it be possible to replicate the downforce and power ratio of those cars and, by effect doing that, the way it produced this amazing era? So just curious thoughts on what we might consider for this next chassis to make the racing great, keep the racing great, keep the driver influence high, and do you think there's any magic from kart we might sprinkle in?
Well, I think that as IndyCar has started to take some of the aero effect out of the cars and started to increase some of the power ratios, when you get those two things and the balance of those two things are part of the solution, I think. I think every series struggles with the same things. It's the balance between the power, the downforce, and then the tire. Those three things are the ones that create the influence of the driver or whatever else. And you see it in NASCAR, you see it in IndyCar, and the fourth thing that they're trying to balance all the time is obviously the cost. In the 90s, when racing was really, really cool as far as the kart cars, the engines that we had back then were making 900 horsepower, 1,000 horsepower some places. And we were literally using 3 different engines a day. And the cost of that engine program was extraordinary. If you were a customer back then, it was $3-4 million if you could get a top line engine. And right now the cost of an engine program is less than $1 million a year. So you're trying to get 700 or 800 horsepower for $1 million a year and run the Indy 500 and do all these other things. So I think continuing to have less of an aero effect, especially through the wings. The underside of the car is probably the cleanest downforce that you can make. But then in conjunction with that, continuing to work with the tire manufacturers, because there's always a balance of having the best tire and being able to promote the best tire from Firestone's perspective versus having a tire that degrades to make the racing quicker without creating marbles or what have you. So some of the best racing that we have, I think, is when the tire degradation is high, the horsepower is high, and the aero effect is low. So you're trying to find that balance all the time.
That's when we make the big memories about drivers. That's when we see the true epic talent come forth, because there's no way the average driver could master everything you just mentioned happening if they weren't supremely talented. Also puts the emphasis on your race engineers to give cars that can work well in that dynamic. So love that. Let's go to Galen Puccini, who says, Tim, with all your years of calling strategy, can you share some either stories or names of drivers you just had a lot of fun working with in terms of race strategy and how the two of you would maybe bond or collaborate on such things?
Yeah, I think the obvious thing that comes to mind really is, when it comes to having fun and growing together was really Elio and I's time together. We were, relatively close in our careers as far as both of us come to the Penske organization, kind of unproven. And then growing forward and for me, I was kind of his big brother in a sense that, I always say he knew about 50 words of English. So I was his interpreter, his strategist, his confidant, and his boss. And, the fact that we were able to win 3 Indy 500s together and accomplish a lot of our career goals, initially, and have a lot of fun knowing his personality and trying to understand when to let it shine and when to maybe put a lid on it was some of the challenge. So I would say, certainly from a fun perspective, I think those were the ones that are most memorable. Some stories I can repeat, and some of them are probably difficult to say publicly. Some
for the autobiography, the
right.
Publish After I'm Buried autobiography that many of us in the sport are preparing. Nathan Cook, staying on the topic of strategy, he says, Tim, which track on the calendar would you say is most difficult from a strategy standpoint? And are there any tracks that you'd love to see return to the calendar just out of passion?
Yeah, I think the most difficult strategies are usually the most fun ones. And it all depends on where you start and where the grid is. And I think different tracks are more difficult depending on whether you're starting up front or starting in mid-pack or at the back. So it's difficult to just say one track because it's always relative to where you start. But the tracks it's not as necessarily the tracks, but I feel like what IndyCar and what's the best is when you have big fuel windows. In other words, a track like Barber with the race distance itself, the abrasiveness of the tires or the track, where you have a large fuel window and a lot of opportunities with tire degradation, creates the best racing because there's different strategies. There's comers and goers relative to tire life. Those are the tracks that are most fun to watch and the most fun to participate in.
Let's go to Bobcat Dad. I love names on social media. He says, Tim, The Penske program projects an image of financial stability season after season. He says, if that's the case, does it allow you to place a greater focus on, say, the Indy 500 in championship runs year after year? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because we know for some teams, not saying they do not arrive at a place of financial stability each year, but maybe not every team goes into the season with the entire budget in place. Just curious, what's the general ability, you would say, from a team like yours or others that tend to have consistent sponsorship? How does it change your focus and how you plan and strategize for the year?
Yeah, without a doubt, resources are important, and no racing is free. A budget has to come from somewhere, some way. But independent of that, I think the biggest influence is really continuity. When you look at the continuity of the drivers, you look at the continuity of the people in general. I've seen a lot of race teams with a lot of resource, that actually a lot more resource than Penske, or at least as much, throughout the years in different disciplines, that aren't nearly as successful, or some of them don't have much success at all. And they fold up for lack of success rather than really lack of funding in some cases. But I think the strength of our organization has always been the continuity of the people. Before my time, that was the case. Now is the case. It's really the continuity year to year to build on what you've done in the past. And when you look at the longevity of the drivers and the successes that Penske has had, and the people, and Marshall, you've done, different stories about, the behind the scenes people within our organization. There's no other organization that really has that type of legacy or that type of loyalty when you look at the years of service. So I think that's our biggest strength, being able to focus on those different things for the following year.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the fact that you, by and large, know what next season will look like, whether it is drivers, who's the front-end mechanic, the right front gearbox, it might not sound like much, but having that knowledge, having that consistency, it allows you to build year after year, whereas, as Tim mentioned, for some teams it might have turnover, might not have all the pieces of the puzzle as early as they would like. There's often a bit of a rebuilding thing that goes on year after year, even if that team's been around for decades. On the inside, there are folks truly just having to meet one another for the first time, figure out working styles, and fill in areas maybe where there's gaps in capabilities and such. So we might see the familiar team names arrive at St. Pete every year. Just not all those teams are necessarily starting at the same point internally in their ability to compete at maximum capability right away. Let's go to... Sorry, Tim, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and I think it's important to have an environment where you promote from within. You can't always do that, but I think knowing that you're setting up a time in which you know who your predecessors are, you know who's next in line for the different things internally, rather than having to bring someone else in, to lead an organization that they don't quite understand or know the people.
I've written about this once or twice with your help too, Tim, and it's an appreciation. And it's when you mention about the promoting from within, you're not just looking at who's a junior member on the IndyCar program who's shown well that you might elevate to a higher position in the IndyCar program. You'll say, hey, there's a kid doing something wonderfully in our Xfinity program, or pick something that's outside of, say, IndyCar or IMSA. You tend to look at the organization, I think, in a bit of a flat standpoint and saying, wow, I think this person over here might really benefit from leaping across to a different program. And I know you've told me there's been a number of times where someone from NASCAR with no IndyCar experience at all is working on a car, engineering a car. Maybe for folks that aren't aware about that, share the inspiration for that, because I would say it's non-traditional.
Yeah, I think when you look at our organization, the uniqueness of having all the disciplines in one building, there's other organizations that have multiple disciplines that they're involved in, but we're the only one that has all of them in the same place, save the one in Australia. But when you look across the board, 500 and some full-time people, it's really my biggest job is to try and put the right people in the right places, and nobody can know everybody. But again, if you have like-minded people and if you trust the management that you have and you're truly trying to promote from within, I call it the 90-day return program. There's a lot of times when I'll say to one of our managers or one of our department heads, hey, take this guy, put him in that spot, or this person, put him in that spot. And if you don't think that they're the right fit, you can return them in 90 days. But try them for 90 days and see if they're the right fit. And honestly, the return rate is very, very low, because I think between our human resources department and our various managers and the way in which we bring people through the organization, good people are good people. And I think our motto is always, look, if you have the right attitude, the right basic skills, we'll teach you the rest, for any specific job.
Ed Joris has two great questions. One of them borrows from Formula One and their what's become now familiar mandatory break in August. He says, Tim, there's a full month between Iowa and Mid-Ohio next year in the calendar. What are the odds of getting IndyCar and the teams to agree on a 1 or 2 week mandatory or voluntary shutdown in there to give your employees a summer vacation? Is that crazy?
Well, I think from the outside, it's something that everybody will look at, and I do think it gives opportunities for people that do have kids of school age and that type of thing to maybe have an opportunity that they don't typically have. And the reason that exists is obviously the Olympics are next year, and NBC is a big part of that. So that's why that lull in the schedule is there. So that's not going to happen the following year, I'm sure, but it's a unique opportunity. But it's hard for us to just stop. And honestly, I feel like there's an importance to continuing continuity and continuing to build without just stopping and walking away. And I think it'll help. It'll help next year in terms of some ways in which we can I guess accommodate those that have those situations. But I don't feel that an overall stoppage is really practical or honestly necessary. But I do think it'll be a welcome thing for many.
Ed also asks, Tim, how different is it for you to watch your son Austin's races versus your regular Team Penske IndyCar race? And he asks, how are your parents' eyes different from your president and team manager and strategist's eyes? That's a good one.
Yeah, I think it's a balance for sure. As far as watching Austin, I'm rarely there at his races. Most of that's because my schedule and the things that I do and my responsibilities. But the fact that now he's racing on television in the modern era, you can listen to the scanners and all that through apps. It's as good as being there, or better in some ways. And for him, I've seen it on both sides, and I think there's approaches that work both ways. But I'd certainly rather be the one in the background. I've been around quite a few racing dads in my life, and some are productive to be there and some are unproductive to be there. And I feel like I always have an opinion because you've been in the business too long, and honestly I feel like maybe in my shoes it might be harder to watch him race because you know too much or you've experienced too many things than maybe a father that hasn't been around racing nearly as much. They don't know what they don't know. It's not good or bad, it's just a fact. So yeah, it's no different than whether it's racing or watching your kids play sports or what they enjoy doing. I'm no different than any other father. I want to see them achieve their goals, and I want to see them achieve their ambitions, and I want to see them have a focus in life. And if they can check all those boxes, then it's a success. And you just want what they want, whatever that is. And it's hard to explain that if you're not a father or a parent. It's hard to maybe explain or understand that. But it puts a bit more insight on what maybe your parents went through after you do it yourself.
Let me ask one follow-up here. I know you aren't someone who is constantly staring at your phone, wondering how someone commented to something you posted on social media. You're not someone, well, granted, you don't have the time to do that, but I know that social media isn't something that dominates your life. But with Austin rising in popularity and stature and growth on the NASCAR side, there's a lot of nasty stuff that also gets sent his way on a daily basis. How do you as a dad deal with that, right? I mean, if someone came up to him in the paddock and said something horrible, I'm sure there would that defense mechanism, wanting to protect my kid thing might come up. But do you pay attention to any of the holy cow, where did that come from type social media that gets blasted your son's way? Or do you try not to do that because you'd probably break your phone in half 12 times a day?
Well, I think it's a good subject to talk about a little bit, because I think that the modern society is so different than the way I grew up. And I'm so thankful that I didn't have to live that side of it. And when you start to think, hey, it's only Austin that gets that, you're wrong. You see some of what you perceive as the most popular people. There's haters everywhere. And, fortunately, he has a mentality that, honestly, it only makes him stronger. And he sees through all those different things. And I think the best advice that you can give anybody in those situations are, if you ask yourself, hey, if there's ever a person that says any of those things that you feel really knows you, then you probably need to listen. But the ones that don't know you and they have an opinion and they have those things to say or whatever else in a negative way, really, there's not a lot of credibility to it. And, I always ask him that if you're in doubt about who you are or how you handled yourself or what you did, the thing to do is go ask your peers and ask the people that know you best, because they should be the ones that answer you honestly. And, I think he's kept that in perspective since he was really young. And Joey Logano gave him some advice one day when he was quite a bit younger. And he said, hey, just keep in mind, the brighter the lights, the more bugs. So don't forget it. It's natural.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my dad said something similar when I was, I think, in my late teens, early 20s, just basically someone has to know you to be able to hurt you, meaning you truly have to. But I would say the opposite is also true. I'll get folks who send something, oh, Marshall, and say something really nice or sweet about something I wrote or whatever. And it feels good, of course, but I also have to keep that in the back of my mind that, like, look, you can't get hyped up for the positives and then down on the negatives. You just need to realize that while some things you get are very kind and others aren't, folks really do have to know you for that to hold any meaning, I should say, something lasting at least to carry forward. So,
no, he's if anything, it motivates him to, continue to just go out there and do his job, and actions certainly speak a lot louder than words.
Stephen Kilsdon thankfully takes us to the team's Australian Supercar program. He says, Tim, the Bathurst 1000 is a few weeks away. This will be the team's 5th attempt at it with the DJR Team Penske effort. He says, in addition to bringing a very fast Mustang to the mountain this year, are there any lessons that maybe have taught you or the team to help in the past to go there fully prepared to win this year? And as if you guys haven't won enough races this year, by the way.
Yeah, it's one that it's certainly on the bucket list to win that race. It doesn't help when they change the rules every other week. So I
get the daily email from speedcafe.com.au. And every day, Tim, it shows up in my inbox. It's just a little, abridged thing of all their stories. And I'm struggling to keep up with the, as you mentioned, seemingly daily rule changes. Yeah,
it's maybe a bit too political on the, I guess when the mice guard the cheese is kind of difficult to figure out how to go, but that's a whole nother subject for another day. But that said, I think we have the tools, the people, and the drivers to win the race, and that's all you can really ask for. I feel that every year you get more and more experience there, whether it's the driver or the team. And Dick Johnson, yeah, he knows, he's been there enough to understand what it takes to win there. And you just have to position yourself to do it. And sometimes it works for you and some days it doesn't. There's been a couple times where I thought we had him covered and it didn't work out. And it's a really, really difficult race to win. But that's why it's so rewarding when you do win.
So Fabian Coulthard, one of your two drivers, is already a star, already a well-known entity when he, as part of the team there. Scotty McLaughlin, though, I mean, I'm guessing you have to feel like you have found a Newgarden-esque driver, a Logano-esque driver where, wow, look at how this person has flourished within this organization. If you could just share some thoughts about him, and maybe for those of us in America who dream of seeing him in a accurate Team Penske or I don't know what entry at the Rolex 24 or something else, tell us about this guy who folks in America might not know, but is standing out like a truly, truly amazing driver.
Yeah, he's special. Yeah, he can get lap time out of a car, in qualifying as good as anybody we've seen. He's really, really good under pressure. He's grown every year. Mentally he gets stronger and stronger. Great team atmosphere. He reminds me of a lot of Mears, although I didn't work with Mears directly, but he has a lot of the same, team first mentalities, but he's ultra competitive, just like Rick is. And yeah, he's somebody that I hope drives for us for a long time, and hopefully he's able to achieve his career goals with us. But when you look at it and you see a lot of these rule changes, he's good enough to where he's influencing what the rules and the parity discussions. If you take his name out of it, if you take his results out of it, I think the results are a lot different. So yeah, he's certainly been a big part of our success, and I think he'll continue to be that for a long time in the future.
Let's go to my friend Jeremiah Morrell from Indiana here. He says, job swap between childhood pals, Governor Eric Holcomb and Tim Cindric. He says, who's better suited to do the other guy's job? Holcomb calling Indy 500 strategy or Tim running the state of Indiana?
Yeah, you talk about irony, just the fact that, I call him Eric. I tell him that everybody else can call him Governor Holcomb or whatever else. I call him Eric. But, the fact that he and I, we grew up in the same little neighborhood, backyard football, little basketball games. I mean, he and I were childhood friends, and all the way, from grade school through high school and, beyond. We didn't go to the same universities, but obviously kept in touch over the years. And to see him achieve his goals and be in the position he's in, I'm really proud of. And I don't get too involved in politics or anything else. I'm pretty far from all that stuff. But to see really what his peers have honored him with and the things that he's doing for the state of Indiana, it's really, really cool to see. But he and I, I can tell you some pretty good stories for another day. But just the irony of that whole situation. And for us when we went to the White House to honor, when President Trump honored, Roger and Simon Pagenaud and all that for winning the Indy 500. And, Eric came there and was in the Oval Office with me. Just to think as kids that we would be standing in the Oval Office together.
Wow.
With the President of the United States and then again, being in kind of the positions we're in and achieving really our career goals together in different ways it's really ironic, to be honest. And, we talk about the day when we can sit on a beach in Sanibel where we used to spring break and, talk about how the hell all that happened. We look forward to that day.
Well, we're just going to go ahead and nominate Governor Holcomb as Elio's strategist for next year's 500, just to make Elio squirm a little bit, but we'll have a little bit of fun at his expense. Let's go to Shay Small, another related fun thing here. He says, the Penske games are entertaining to watch. He says, have you or any of the other non-drivers ever thought to enter in some of the on-camera shenanigans?
That came up originally, and Roger and I both bowed out of that pretty quickly. So, yeah, I think that might be another stage for another time. Now that we kind of understand the concept. So, I don't think you ever say never. And maybe there's a sidebar there at some point in life, but, I wouldn't hold your breath.
You and Roger, competing to unfold Frozen t-shirts. Now that would be an interesting one. Let's see. Let's go to a couple here from Reddit. This comes in from Maze6365, who says, we hear a lot on broadcasts and from others about the, quote, Penske way. Says, Tim, curious how you would define the Penske way. And he also says, what was the first experience working with Team Penske where you recognized that there was a different way of doing things within the organization?
Well, I think we touched on a little bit of that earlier.
Yep.
It's really the culture that exists there, and the can-do attitude that Roger really is the one that demonstrates the most, because I feel like, maybe my example maybe that comes to mind is understanding that you have to approach everything with everything as possible, and you have to look at things with how can it happen. And you have to look outside the box of, honestly, reality sometimes. And you have to say, look, the only way that can happen is if we were able to charter Air Force One to deliver that engine, across the seas.
Yeah. And
if you go to Roger with a solution, as impractical as it might seem, he'll be satisfied with that. And for him to tell you, look, we're not going to go to that extent, that's almost a success, rather than go to him with, Roger, we just can't do that. And then him come to you with, well, we can do that if we do this, this, and this. And then you go, oh, okay, if you want to go to that extent, you're right, we can do that. So I think, he sets the bar pretty high, and it's our job to come there with solutions to problems. And if you have that mindset, you'll be successful in our environment, as long as you're a team player. And we're certainly not perfect as an organization. And, you always look at, hey, what's the bottom 10%? How do we improve the bottom 10%? And when you continue to look at how to continue to get better. And for me, when I came into the organization, my biggest fear was not being able to uphold the Penske tradition or legacy, or basically the question to me was, what is it that I can contribute? What is it that I'm bringing to the party here? Because it seemed from the outside that all those things were in place. And after you get kind of behind the curtain, especially at that point in time when things weren't so good in the IndyCar world, and then, to move over to the NASCAR world in 2005 and understand, hey, it's a winning organization, but it's not a consistently winning organization. How do we get it to that point? And then be able to look back and say, you know what, we've kind of been able to create our own chapter within the Penske legacy is pretty satisfying.
One of the things I enjoyed most, Tim, during April and May, capturing the interviews with yourself and many others for the podcast series I did, how Roger Penske changed the Indy 500, was hearing on the topic of the Penske way, how it's practiced or how it's passed on. And there's no, quote, book, all right, employee, on day one, read the Penske way book, and this will tell you everything. It's a culture of expectation. It's a culture of holding each other accountable in a positive way. So from Myron, John Booslog, talking about the thing that just killed him at some point early in his career was having RP come in the morning, and whether it was pick up a piece of trash that was beneath a tent, or there was a empty bottle of water or something someone had consumed and not thrown away, watching RP walk in under the tent in the morning, and instead of just tuning out everything around him and just walking the path into the trailer, no, he walked in as a complete neutral observer, wanting to assess the quality of presentation, and would pick up any little things that he thought were out of place or should have been thrown away. And just hearing Myron talk about when he saw that for the first time, it just killed him. And then it became something where when he came in the morning, obviously trying to get in before RP, it's a case of walking into the tent and looking at it like Roger. What things might he see that stand out? Let me address that before he gets here, not just to appease him, but to make that the daily standard and also something that we actively manage. Or hearing about, boy, we were really proud about how we were polishing this and polishing that and trying to make everything perfect. And then having one of the veteran, old school mechanics say, yeah, that's great, son, but you missed this little thing here, which the person might have never thought of to try and polish or prepare. Just little things like that where you go, aha, it's not just, I've been a mechanic for 20 years, I'm going to turn the bolt the same way, do the same thing. It's a constant mental refreshing of look at your surroundings, how can things look better, be performed better, and pass that on, make sure that that standard is maintained from person to person, year after year, decade after decade. That I really enjoy those conversations of hearing all the little examples of how folks tried to contribute their own way to the Penske way.
Yeah, I think it's really based on initiative. And if you have the initiative to ask yourself, how can we be better today? It's certainly not an environment for those that want to hide. If you're trying to get through the day, with the least amount of input or energy, sooner or later, it's probably not going to be your environment. And I say it all the time, there's a lot of highly skilled people that will be very successful in life. Just, it might not be the environment that they'll succeed in. And there's quite a few successful people that will continue to be successful, but probably wouldn't be in our world.
Let's get down to the last couple of questions here, Tim. One comes in from Daruslar. It says, you guys run with Chevy and IndyCar, Acura/Honda and IMSA, Ford and NASCAR, and Down Under and Supercars. Curious about the diversity of manufacturers and if this ever causes issues between your partners. It's a good one, right? And folks at the Ganassi organization get that as well, knowing that they represent a variety of, I think, the same manufacturers, but in a slightly different order depending on the series. How do you manage that, Tim, knowing that on one weekend you are trying to win for Honda in one series, and like last weekend and this weekend, you're doing your best to keep them out of victory lane?
Yeah, it's ironic, but then when you look at it, the mentality that our car dealership world has, when you look at the fact that Roger has 300 and some car dealerships around the world, and all the different brands that we represent in that world as well. There's a bit of a strategy there as far as not having all your eggs in one basket, especially with the way motorsports works in general. But at the same time, it's our job to be successful. And if you're successful for those different brands and you do it with integrity, I think you have a stronger racing organization and one that can really bring the strengths out of all those different brands into our organization. But I think kind of one of the times that I'll remember that question the most, and we get it once in a while, but was sitting across from Edsel Ford in 2012 when we decided to go from a Dodge NASCAR program to a Ford program. Edsel asked me pretty much that exact same question in our boardroom. And, I guess all I could say to him was, Mr. Ford, I hope, a couple of years from now, you sit across the table and not have any concerns on that front, because we've been successful together. And fortunately, we've been able to deliver on that end. And those questions go away if you do it, in a successful way with integrity.
It also speaks to an organization like yours or Ganassi's. Michael Andretti, obviously, they have a fairly diversified team. There are a number of teams that play in multiple series with different manufacturers, and the integrity part, something where you have to wall off what you do with your IndyCar program versus manufacturers in other series. Obviously, these manufacturers would not sign extensions and keep coming back if across those various teams there was not the integrity to make sure that the interests of those manufacturers were not maintained as expected. So you'd find out pretty quickly, or any team playing in multiple areas with multiple manufacturers would find out pretty quickly if they were doing the job expected. So it's always good to see when these things continue for many years. Let's go to John Hankins talking about series. And had a couple people ask, saying, Penske's involved in many championships. Why not Indy Lights? I know you and I have discussed this before, but for those who haven't heard the answer, maybe share your thoughts there.
Yeah, obviously the ladder series is something that's important for really any discipline in racing. But at the end of the day, when you look at it from a brand perspective, the brand itself really doesn't deal with much below the top echelon of whatever it deals with or whatever it puts its name on. So, the Penske brand is typically one that's, in the elite forms of whatever it's involved with. And that's not to say that the ladder series or whatever else is beneath the organization, but anything that you're involved in, my time, if we're involved in the ladder series, you still have a responsibility to that driver, those people. It has to be 100%. And at the end of the day, it's still human in that car. So whether that person, has an accident or has a trouble or whatever else, the amount of time and the amount of effort that's put into that program shouldn't be any different than any other program that we do. And really, we feel that it's not the place to put our efforts. And we typically feel that for a driver to be ready to win a championship and a driver to be ready to compete at the top levels, they're going to have to spend a couple of years understanding all the nuances of not how you go fast, but how you win and how you win on a consistent basis. And I think you see that these drivers don't come out of Xfinity, or they don't come out of Indy Lights or the Super 2 series or whatever else and make an immediate impact on the championship. They might win a race, or they might be fast, or might have a pole, but it takes a little while to learn how to win and whatever else. But it's no different than our goals in sports car racing. There's so many times when we could have gone to Le Mans as a factory program. We could have gone to Le Mans and raced so many times, but not at the top level. And Roger's always said, look, if we're going to go there, I want to go there where I'm competing for an overall win and not receiving a trophy for being 30 laps down. The brand is really with what it's been is more about being in the elite groups rather than just participating.
Looking at Joseph Newgarden as the ultimate example, and at least the expectations set, you want to be able to win championships right away, first year with whomever that you sign. You look at someone like Joseph, who developed with another team and clearly showed he was ready to win championships given the right opportunity. That timing worked out perfectly, and we saw what he delivered. So, and that's no disrespect to the Indy Lights series, just at least traditionally, we haven't seen the Penske organization say, we're going to spend a couple of years watching you find your feet, and then hopefully X amount of years down the road, we might be able to get there. It's more of a perform now, win now culture. So,
and we've that said, we're not adverse to doing that. And, Austin's not the first one that we've tried to bring up in that way. When you look at it, really, it's happened more in the NASCAR world.
Yeah.
Where, we've brought Parker Kligerman forward. We've brought Justin Allgaier forward, and they got to a certain point in the organization. But then the next program was Ryan Blaney. And Ryan Blaney is the example of the one that has come, from racing ARCA trucks, Xfinity, then he went to the Wood Brothers, and then he's at the Cup level in one of our cars. And so we're not adverse to doing that and bringing them through the different series. So it's not that we say we don't do that. It's just a very difficult thing to do. And it's one in which a lot of things have to align themselves, because fortunately for me, I've never had to work in my time with Roger with any driver that's brought funding to the program for that purpose only. There's drivers that that have been in the program and sponsors come along at the same time, but they've never been tied together. And when you look at the lower forms of motorsport, there's a lot of people that don't understand it, that say, oh, well, this person bought a ride and that person bought a ride and whatever else. Well, that's pretty much what happens at all levels of motorsport, is that it's not free, and the funding has to come from somewhere, whether their parents are writing the check, or their parents' friend is writing the check,
sure,
or some sponsor is. The money comes from somewhere, and the team is always the one that has to take the overall responsibility for whatever might happen. But the facts that to go all the way up through the ladder, you have to have some things in line, and we were very fortunate to have, Verizon couldn't compete at the cup level because at that point in time, obviously Sprint was involved. So there was an Xfinity program that was funded, and we were able to bring up, drivers that we were able to choose, not ones that we, brought up for business reasons. And, Austin was very, very fortunate to have Moneyline get behind him in the Xfinity program this year, because without them, he wouldn't have had a full-time ride this year either. So there's a lot of things that have to come together to be able to make those programs happen and walk through the ladder system. And it's very few and far between without them being directly tied to a particular driver. Because then somebody in my shoes has to ask themselves, hang on a minute, is the driver working for us?
Yeah.
or
Sure.
or is the driver in charge? And, that's always a difficult situation.
Brett Ross asks one that I look forward to hearing the answer on. He says, what was your best memory from playing college basketball? And has anyone at Team Penske challenged you to a game or a shooting contest?
My basketball days are way gone. And, I think my basketball career seems to get better every year, because I hear more and more stories about, basketball times. Honestly, my favorite memories about my time playing basketball was in high school, because Indiana high school basketball at the time that I played in the mid 80s, where it was very similar to the movie Hoosiers, if you're familiar with that, was playing in, there was only one level, and whether it was a small school or a huge school, everybody played in the same, high school championship.
Sure.
And for that, it was, you felt larger than life to play Indiana high school basketball. And anything after that, honestly, didn't compare. My better memories are, although, my Rose-Hulman was a great place to go to school. It was Division III, and playing basketball there, it was fun, but you're focused on your career more so than your basketball dreams.
I think between you there, Mazda Motorsports boss John Doonan, who I think played D3 ball at Augustana, we might have to have some sort of, old school D3 basketball game at some point with various folks in open wheel and sports cars.
Now that I think about it, I think the one life lesson that I learned the most from in college basketball, we were the first American university to ever play basketball in communist Russia. And I was able to go to communist Russia and play basketball. And I must have been 19 or 20 years old. It was 19 years old. To go over to communist Russia and play gave you such patriotism for the rest of your life.
Wow.
About what America is all about, what opportunities you have here. And then we spent the next 2 weeks playing across. We went to Belgium and all the way across Europe to where New Year's Eve we ended up playing in London and experienced New Year's Eve in Trafalgar Square as a 19-year-old after, 2 weeks earlier being in communist Russia. It was quite a life-changing experience from, I guess, a perspective point of view, less than a basketball point of view.
Wow. That's amazing, man. I had no idea. All right. Last couple here. We've got a couple folks who asked this in some way, shape, or form, and I think it just shows the reverie for the quality of the DJR Aussie program. Kevin Pinkston says, would there be any possibility your supercar drivers might get a chance driving something here Penske related in the U.S. at some point, maybe more as a one-off than a full-time deal?
Well, you never say never, and love to see that, and we'll continue to try and figure out what's the best opportunities on those fronts, and yeah, I'd like to see that happen. I can't promise that it will or that it won't, and you know, Scott in particular, when we look at that and talk about it, he understands that his focus, you know, needs to be in the supercars world. And if there's opportunities that come up, again, it comes back to trusting who you work for. And, you know, hopefully the moons align, because I know we'd all like to see that happen. It'd be pretty cool.
One more management question for you comes in from Bo Blaylock, who says he uses you as an inspiration on how he runs his organization. And his question is about how you motivate your core of senior managers to get the best out of their direct reports. It's an interesting one, right? Because I think in some cases, folks might think of yourself or Mike Hull or whomever walking right out into the garage and saying, do this, do that. But you have your management structure in place. How do you manage your managers, Tim, to get them to get the most out of their employees?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'm always learning. And when you have a pretty good example at the top, you know, being Roger and the people that work for him in the different ways, you have lots of resources to kind of bounce ideas or whatever off of. And I'm probably less of a rah-rah guy than maybe some of the more successful people, and pretty results driven in a sense of almost boring sometimes, I would say. But I think it really has to do with being able to balance accountability. You have to have accountability within your people and within your staff. But I think communication is very, very important amongst the group. And really just being able to not micromanage what it is that you do, but also have the lead by example mentality, you know, to a certain degree, and recognize those and be able to not be so worried about where the credit actually exists. And, you know, I think keeping score or, you know, managing where the credit lies is sometimes where some organizations and managers get stuck, because I think those that aren't comfortable or have enough self-confidence are the ones that you typically hear calling it my team or my group or my department. And you hear the word my a lot rather than the word our. And, you know, changing that mindset a bit, and where it becomes our team and, you know, the things that we did. I think the more that you hear of that, the more successful and the better place it is.
2 to go. We're going to go with my pal Andrew C. He says, Tim, when you get a rare day off in racing, what's your favorite activity or hobby that is not racing related? You know, I don't have a whole lot of hobbies. I mean, I try and stay in shape. I try and mountain bike whenever I can, but I wouldn't say I'm good at it. It's just a matter of fitness or whatever else, but it really comes down to family. I think, you know, the four of us, being my two sons, Tanner and Austin, and my wife, Megan, I think between them and, you know, our dog Wallace, that's the things that we enjoy the most, is to get away together. So I think it's really more around family-centric things. Sleep is a hobby. I've come to believe that. So that's one of it's not a hobby I get to practice very often, but good Lord, I look forward to it. All right, well, let's close, and I saved these for the end because I loved them. Got 2 here from Kyle Donnelly and also Howard Bennett. Kyle says, has Tim held the chalice of excellence? And does he have any insight on its forging? And he also says, will the chalice be jealous of the Astor Cup potentially stealing its thunder this week? And then Howard Bennett says, Tim, where does the chalice of excellence go in the off season? So we got to close on, you know, you got something mystical in your presence here. So Where did it come from? You think there might be jealousy involved, and is it stored in some magical cave during the off-season?
I can remember sitting on my couch watching Game of Thrones as I get a text from Joseph asking my opinion about what essentially became the chalice in the off-season. And I sent him a couple other examples of what we might be able to use, but the concept that he and Travis Law, our chief mechanic, had was to within the team pass around some symbol of appreciation, week in and week out. And, I thought it's one of those things where you want things like that to originate within the masses rather than being dictated from the top, because they're always more successful that way. And it's a great example of how a driver, no different than a quarterback on a football team, can be a huge positive influence for the camaraderie of the group, because they're not the boss. They have a unique position there where they have a lot of influence, but they're not the one that's looked at as the person that hires and fires and decides what they get paid. So, hats off to Joseph for really initiating a lot of that. But the chalice itself is honestly a pretty cheap little trinket, if you will, that they found online. That was sort of Game of Thrones-ish, because a lot of us were pretty involved in that show. But yeah, it kind of created a life of its own, and it's been a very positive influence in that little group, and it's been a fun thing to be part of. Myself, I received the chalice.
Was it Detroit or before Detroit?
It was Detroit prior to the second race of it would have been prior to the first race of Detroit, which I guess was somewhat magical because we had a very unexpected victory that day. It's where I was given the chalice pre-race before race one in Detroit. Joseph ended up winning the race in Detroit really because of a caution that came out at exactly the right time. And then I didn't really get to keep the chalice 24 hours before I passed it on after Detroit. So I didn't get to hold it throughout the week, but the chalice has had kind of different experiences, as would a kind of a very, very small version of the Stanley Cup, where it gets passed around or things happen to it during the week or with it during the week. But in the off season, it'll be interesting to see really what concept comes there. But hopefully it's a good problem to have.
I have it on my list of things to write about in the postseason here, of truly one of the most fun and unexpected things to happen in IndyCar this year. And it has been a blast. I really hope folks have been following it on Instagram, because the stories have just been hilarious. Tim, thanks so much for taking some time here, brother. Not only did you go into overtime here, but I think folks are really going to enjoy answers to a lot of the great questions that came in. I look forward to seeing you here tomorrow in Monterey, and hopefully sometime during the off season we can have you back on again.
Thanks, Marshall. I appreciate having the time to reflect. Sometimes you don't do that very often, and I enjoy listening to some of that on my own. Thanks.
It is a bright day wherever I am. Could be clouds in the sky, rain could be falling, but when I'm on the phone with Anders Krohn, hey, that rhymes, things get super shiny. How are you, my Road to Indy comrade?
I am doing glorious, Marshall, and can't wait to close out the Road to Indy season here this weekend. It's going to be very exciting.
Before we get to the questions that were sent in for your lovely Norwegian self, the main topic for our conversation, Road to Indy championships need to be settled in all three classes, starting at the bottom in USF 2000, in the middle, what we used to call Pro Mazda, what we now call Indy Pro 2000, and at the top in Indy Lights. Where shall we start? Because of those three, one's a bit of a formality.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the most exciting battle, in my opinion, has been the USF 2000 battle this year, and just kind of seeing the change of dominance, as it were, where you've had now 6-7 years of straight up Cape Motorsports domination, and suddenly you have a very hungry young gun, Hunter McElrea, with Pabst coming to the fore, and he's now leading the championship. He took the championship lead in Portland away from Braden Eves, who drives for Cape Motorsports, and I think it's just been fascinating kind of seeing how strong Braden Eves was the front half of the year with Cape Motorsports, with all their data, with all their dominance, and now, you've just seen, Hunter McElrea in his first year here in America, learning the tracks, learning the car, gelling with Pabst Racing. And I think he's 6 points to the good now of Braden Eves coming into Laguna Seca. So I think it's going to be fascinating to see what happens here. Wouldn't be surprised to see if there's some team games, some strategy being played out.
Yeah. And if we were having this conversation 2 months ago, we might have been preparing that title for Braden. Super impressive year. Whether he wins or does not win the title this weekend in Monterey, there's no doubt this kid is extremely good and hopefully headed for Indy Pro 2000 no matter what. I do love the Hunter McElrea story. California-born kid, I believe, then transported. Maybe he got lost. Maybe it's a little bit of a Gilligan's Island thing. I don't know. They threw him on a raft. Ended up in New Zealand. Has come back. And in this first real let me show you what I can do type season, boy, this kid has come on strong. What are you a fan of, Anders, knowing that you have coached? I mean, you've been up the ladder yourself as a driver, but as a coach, you name it. What do you like? Do you like the kid that starts strong, holds strong, is there or thereabouts at the front all season? Or do you like someone like a Hunter maybe who thereabouts, but has really rallied to close the year, now finds himself with a small lead coming into the finale?
I mean, I really love the story of Hunter, and kind of came into the season a little bit of as an underdog. He did win the Mazda scholarship to move into the USF 2000 category this year, so he was sort of already on the map. But I think underdog in the sense that he'd never driven on these tracks before, unknown quantity in the US, and I love just how he's built momentum into his season, and I think it really shows the maturity within him, because he could have very easily, after the first half of the season, said, well, I'm out of this championship battle. I'm just going to go wreck some stuff now and throw it off the track. But instead, he's just worked at it so methodically. And I think that's the sign of a true future champion. That's not taking anything away from Braden Eves, and I think he's done a tremendous job as well. But I just love the progression you've seen throughout the course of the year with Hunter, and you can really feel like it started clicking for him. And once it started clicking for him, once he realized how aggressive he has to be on opening laps, how aggressive he has to be to get the tires up to temp, you can just sort of see his championship trajectory take off. So wouldn't be completely surprised to see him dominate again at Laguna Seca. But then again, Cape Motorsports, they've made a lot of championships happen in the past, and that's not an accident. So for sure, they're going to pull out all the stops as well.
Before we move on to Indy Pro 2000, should also say that it's kind of fun looking at this Kiwi American kid in McElrea, who's leading right now, All-American, and Braden Eves right behind him. Really a toss-up who's going to come out on top. We also look right behind them, teammates. We got Darren Keene from the Cape stable, another young American. Colin Kaminsky as well, another young American on the Pabst side. Those two have had very, I would say, solid years, shown us some really good things. I know that there's a Danish rookie as well, Christian Rasmussen, talking part of the Jay Howard development program there. I know that Hunter and Braden are going to be the ones that probably get most of our attention this weekend at Laguna Seca, but at least if we're looking into next year, maybe, assuming that some of those that I just mentioned might return for another year, who knows, but nonetheless, we're not just talking, Anders, about two quality kids in USF 2000 who might move up. There's more talent here for sure.
Oh, I completely agree, and you nailed it right on the head with Christian Rasmussen. I think he's got so much so much raw talent. I think he got his first win in Toronto, and then he got another win at Mid-Ohio. And he's another one of those that season started off a little bit slower than the likes of Hunter McElroy, but now last couple of weekends he's basically scored equal points with the two guys at the top of the championship. So I think if he were to return next year, yeah, watch out. He could be one to play for the championship for sure.
Let's jump up, not to get beat down, broken down to our very last compound, as I badly quote KRS-One and Boogie Down Productions. Let's move to the kid who mollywopped the US F2000 championship last year, that being Florida's Kyle Kirkwood, who is looking like he is marching possibly towards back-to-back championships. Tell me about Kirkwood from your perspective of maturity. It's a kid who we know is super fast, Anders. Also know that at least reputation-wise came into his recent seasons with a little bit of reputation for being his own number one fan. Have you seen that dial back a little bit? What have you seen in this kid?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't know if I've ever seen that, but I think I probably underestimated him and his talent going into this year, because I thought, I thought to some extent that he was, he lost the championship last year, but I thought, okay, maybe that's just the Cape Motorsports difference. And then he started off the year this year quite rocky with RP Motorsport. I mean, they weren't at the front of the field, and again, first half of the year, a bit similar to US F2000. It looked like it was going to be Rasmus Lind just walking away with the championship with Juncos Racing, but then something clicked sort of in a similar fashion with Hunter McElroy. And I think Kyle Kirkwood now has won, the last 7 out of the 8 races, or 8 out of 9 last races. So, I mean, he's really clicked. And I think for me, his stock has risen significantly this year, because he won the championship. He dominated the championship last year with proven material. But the job that he's done this year is he's dominated with unproven material. And so I think that's been the most impressive thing with him, is how he's developed that car. Again, very mature shoulders to kind of know, you're at the back foot in the championship, but they've just methodically worked their way forward. So in my opinion, he's gone from being someone that I thought was very good to potential superstar.
Looking at the stat here provided by our friends at the Road to Indy of Kyle having won 20 times from the 28 Road to Indy starts he's done so far, I mean, that it almost doesn't require a story. You just gotta post that and go, if you need more context, I can't help you, because that number says a lot. Knowing some of the other drivers who are, I guess, hoping to win the title, but again, if Kyle doesn't win the Indy Pro 2000 title, I will be somewhat surprised, but that to me doesn't speak negatively, Anders, of those who might not. And I'm looking at some of the names of those who have been chasing him. I mean, we know Parker Thompson, he's a beast. The Able Motorsports team hasn't been a full season, I believe, for Parker at every single round, but we know that he's done some really good work this year. Daniel Frost as well has impressed me. The driver with the best name in all of motor racing, Stingray Robb, I think as well, has shown me the progression year to year, where it looks like there's some talent to certainly develop. But I'd say the one that really jumps out, the one that, if we're talking, I don't know if shock is the word, but I'm hoping folks are standing up and paying attention to, Rasmus Lind. Tell us about this young Swede, as it seems like IndyCar might be, I don't know, 20% Swedish, 25% Swedish here if we're not careful the next couple of years, man. That's a good thing.
Yeah, he's been very impressive, and obviously he did USF 2000 last year, finished second in that championship behind Kyle Kirkwood, and he just gradually got stronger and stronger throughout the course of the year. He wasn't necessarily a match for Kirkwood, but he was in different machinery, and I think he did a bang up job first half of the year this year, and I'm not sure if it's he maybe stalled out a little bit second half of the year, and maybe felt the pressure of the championship a little bit too much, or whether they just weren't hitting on the right setups. But it just seemed like as Kirkwood really, really found his feet and got stronger and stronger, it felt like Rasmus Lind and Juncos Racing were maybe a bit stagnant the second half of the season. So they definitely have to kind of just take the gloves off and go fist fighting at Laguna Seca, because it's the only chance they have in the championship. So he just really needs to kind of let his guard down, not race with raised shoulders, and just kind of let go and go for it. I think that's his only hope. But I agree with you. I think he's got a lot of talent, and obviously he's managed by Stefan Johansson, so he's got some really, really good support behind him as well.
Let's cover off one more item, Anders, on Indy Pro 2000, which I think is probably the most unique level of the three tiers in regards to team development, right? Whether it's the D-Force program, Abel obviously trying to become a powerhouse, Turn 3, for example. I mean, Jay Howard, we know, as a quality outfit with his F4 and F3, work in the SCCA side. But just share with folks who aren't aware that while there are some teams that have been staples, as we mentioned, Cape and USF 2000. I mean, I've known the Cape brothers probably before you were born, which is a sad thing to say. But, we look at Indy Lights and, of course, there's Andretti. There, again, some staples. But even the RP Motorsport you mentioned that Kyle Kirkwood, the championship leader, is driving for, really does seem that Indy Pro 2000 is a place that has a lot of growth on the team side. Why is that?
To be honest with you, I have no idea other than I can think of maybe teams look at USF 2000 and say, well, we feel like between Pabst and Cape, they have such a strong dominance that, we'd be silly to enter that as a first-time team. So maybe that is where someone like, an RP Motorsport saw an opportunity. Obviously, Exclusive Motorsport as well have actually done a tremendous job. First stepping up from F1600, then USF 2000, now Indy Pro 2000. So, I mean, maybe it is just that little bit of a threshold of, okay, well, we're not so fearful of entering the category because we don't really see one team stand out shoulders and heads above everyone else. So I guess that's the only thing I can think of. And as far as the budgets are concerned, obviously they're more than USF 2000, but I wouldn't be surprised if maybe the opportunity for teams to make a bit of money is a bit better in Indy Pro 2000 than it is in USF 2000, where I know margins are extremely slim. So that could be that could be a factor as well.
Let's close our look at the championship scenarios here in Indy Lights. I have gone out and purchased a couple of big rolls of bubble wrap so that we can put that all around Oliver Askew, frankly, so he kind of looks like the Michelin Man, because honestly, all that can really derail the kid from being champion is some sort of freak accident. We're going to need to hire bodyguards to surround him, multiple hire cars to protect whatever he's driving. I mean, truly, it's just like trying to protect a Fabergé egg being transported from one museum to the other. Just don't let it break, and everything will be fine. Tell us about this kid's Indy Lights season going up against the phenomenal Rinus VeeKay in a Juncos car, which, no disrespect to the Juncos team, it's not where the Andretti Autosport team is with Oliver's entry. Tell us about Oliver's year, and then maybe give us some context of how impressed people should be about Rinus and what he's done in a car that hasn't always been the exact measure of his direct rivals. Yeah,
I mean, I think, if we cover off on Oliver first, I think he's made the absolute most of the opportunity that he was given. It was, the deal with Andretti Autosport came together very late. He didn't have all that much testing, but I think he's just done exactly what he needed to do throughout the course of the year. He sort of slowly but surely built momentum in his year, dominated when he had the chance to dominate, didn't really put the car at risk anywhere else. So when he didn't have the pace, he would settle for a third or a fourth. But more often than not, he was always on the podium and just did a great job. And I think that's part of the luxury when A, you're as talented as he is, and B, when you have the machinery that he does, then you can take that approach a little bit more of, okay, if I don't have the outright pace to win and dominate, then hey, I can at least settle for a podium finish. And I think it was maybe a little bit of a different scenario to Rinus VeeKay, who didn't necessarily have the same equipment and therefore didn't have the luxury of taking a slightly more conservative approach. So I think with VK, you saw a couple of instances throughout the course of the year where he probably could have been a little more conservative. Toronto, for example, second race when he went side by side with Aaron Telitz, who had nothing to lose whatsoever, took him out of the race. And essentially that is, in my opinion, what kind of snowballed him being out of firm contention for the championship. And I think it's been interesting to see how he's had to be so much more aggressive to keep up with the Andretti Autosport car, and whether that is him compromising for the lack of the car, or whether it is Oliver Askew having taken himself to a whole nother level, I'm not sure. But what I will say is I feel strongly that the two of them are in a very, very similar category to what we saw with Colton Herta and Pato O'Ward last year, in that they are both generational talents, someone that I feel strongly, once they do get their opportunity in IndyCar, can go on to be race winners in their first year. So I think it's crazy that over the last few years we've had these relatively small fields in Indy Lights, but every year we've generated 1 to 2 drivers that, in my opinion, can be superstars, and I think that's exactly what we have with both of them. And then you look, slightly behind them on the grid, you have some drivers as well that are, really, really nipping at their heels. Robert McGuinness, he's had a couple of wins this year. He's, had a little bit of a downturn in the second half of the year, but shown that, hey, I can be right there with Oliver Askew. So I think if he comes back for a second year, he'll be strong.
Totally.
Ryan Norman, he got his first road course win. So, I mean, I think, and Toby Sowery, let's not forget about him. Someone that's, came into the season without a single test day, zero assurance of doing anything more than the first race weekend. And here he is, multiple podiums later, a race win. And I think he's the kind of guy that if you're out there as a team owner shopping for your championship winner for next year, if you're an Andretti Autosport or a home course racing, I think your number one call has to be Toby Sowery.
100%. I'm also impressed with what I've seen from 9-year-old David Malukas in his rookie Indy Lights season. I mean, he truly looks like he's still got, just milk and cereal on his face when I see him. He's so young. That just speaks, though, Anders, to how much he has to learn, and therefore, at least for me, how impressive it's been to see him not being up front. I wasn't expecting him to just knock the world down here, especially with a new team trying to come in. But nonetheless, he's impressed me as well, knowing that his learning curve is certainly deeper than the rest. Another one who I hope continues next year and in the years to come with the, I just recently learned, I believe it's Henry Malukas Drivers is the what HMD stands for, the HMD Motorsports team. So, yeah, I mean, there's not only a lot of talent here, even if we hopefully lose Renus and Oliver coming out of the 19 season, knowing that a Kyle Kirkwood and hopefully 1 or 2 others should be stepping up as well. Feeling pretty good about where Indy Lights should be next year. Let's get to the questions that have come in for you. First one, and I like the phrasing of this coming in from our man Justin Brockwell. Sounds like you're going to have to explain your decisions here. For Anders, no Iowa or Richmond on the road to Indy calendars. How come? He says these drivers are supposedly reaching for the Indy 500 someday. Right now, driver X can come from anywhere and win a Lights title and the scholarship cash, then show up Indianapolis touting their, quote, 2 oval races worth of history. Should our latter series feature the same diversity as the IndyCar calendar?
Very, very good question. And there's actually a couple of main reasons for it. The first one just simply comes down to finance, and that is the fact that whenever you're on an oval, your car is significantly more exposed to a big crash than it is on a road course, and as such, the team owners know that crash damage, since it has to be paid by the drivers on the road to Indy, can eliminate drivers from the championship. So it's a conscious decision to say, okay, let's try and add ovals that bring value so they can learn as much as possible while doing as few of them as possible so that we don't have the budgetary concern. The second one is there's actually a survey that goes out to all the team owners at the end of each year on, okay, which event do you prefer as a team owner? What makes sense for you logistically and so on forth. So I think while I completely agree with you that both Iowa and Richmond would be amazing tracks, they just don't they don't make the cut with all the other tracks you have to be at. And in the case of an Indy Lights, from a budgetary perspective, they don't want to expand that to 12 weekends. So unfortunately, those were the two kind of hanging the lowest, and so they got taken away. So I wouldn't be surprised to see them revisit that if grid numbers start going up significantly and kind of they feel like the budget situation isn't as much of a concern. But while the way it is right now, I think that's the primary reason.
Talking about low-hanging things again, you're such a pervert, Krohn. I've talked to you about this many times.
Oh, dear.
All right.
Oh, dear.
So we covered part of Jameen Tuttle's question, but this is a good angle to it. He says, hey, guys, how are things looking for some of the drivers who are in, say, 3rd to 6th place in Indy Pro or USF 2000 next year, the Frosts, Thompsons, etc.? Says those guys are great, and I'd hate to lose them. Do you have any feeling? I know we haven't even finished the season, Anders, so we can't exactly say we know who all's returning where, but do you have at least some sense on how many of the promising drivers Jameen mentions who might not be in the title frame yet are looking to come back and continue learning, continue developing themselves next year?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure who's going to land where, who's going to stay, who's going to go, and who's going to move up. But it's always, having been a driver, I know I was always anxious to try and make the next step up. But sometimes the key to your career can actually be to hold back for an additional year if you did finish 6th or 5th or whatever in the championship, and then truly go for a championship run, as opposed to maybe a low budget season in Indy Lights where you don't get the results that you necessarily should. So it's a difficult thing to figure out, because your backers probably want you to move up as quickly as possible because they want to see you as near the Indy 500 as you can possibly be, whereas maybe for your own career, for your own sake, it's better to stay back for another year. So it's a fine balance that the parents and managers and all the associated parties kind of have to figure out together. But certainly if I'm sitting 5th in Indy Pro 2000 right now, I'm thinking unless there is a very, very important commercial reason to move up to Indy Lights, I'm going to do another year of Indy Pro 2000 and try and win that championship. And the same being the case really for USF 2000.
We're going to head to your general home region here for our next question from Gustav Alcrona, who says to Anders, I just love your appearances on Viasat Motor and the fact that you were talking Swedish. He says, did you speak fluent Swedish before you became the expert commentator in Swedish coverage of IndyCar?
All right. Well, I appreciate the wonderful sentiment. And tell you, I did a lot of karting in Sweden when I was 10, 11 years old. So I actually got to learn Swedish when I was that age. But then really, until Viasat approached me in this off season, I hadn't properly talked Swedish in 10, 15 years. So it was a very, very quick sort of get up to speed, talk Swedish on the phone with as many Swedish people as I could, just try watching Swedish TV and just try to get up to speed with it. So I still feel like I'm not fully up to speed on it yet, but that I felt like with every single weekend it's gotten better and better, and it's been really, really cool to increase my following so much in Sweden and have so many people follow me from Sweden. So it's been an absolute blast doing the Swedish TV shows and the pre-race shows. And I think the other really cool thing is, with as big as the fan following is in Sweden, we've actually got a ton of great drivers and people on our pre-race show. We had Jay Fry at Gateway. We've had James Hinchcliffe on. I mean, we've had so many we've had Scott Dixon on. So it's been fantastic to kind of expose all these great champions and well-known people inside the sport here and expose them to the culture in Sweden. So no, absolutely loved every minute and appreciate that lovely sentiment.
All right. Well, I guess I'm going to go ahead and bring this up. So to my knowledge, other than the 2 Swedish IndyCar drivers in the paddock, there's only one person I know of who grew up at a auto repair shop that was dedicated solely to British and Swedish cars. And then, in the latter stages, his father owned Park Road Saab service and did nothing but Saabs and Volvos. So, you're talking about interesting people in the paddock to bring to the Swedish audience. I'm just saying the guy you're talking to here might have busted his knuckles on more Saabs and Volvos and at least impaled himself on Swedish metal over the years, but that's okay. I guess I'm not, the caliber of those interesting people. I get it. None of them love Sweden like I do, but that's okay. Let's see how it is.
Now I'm mad at you because you're only telling me this now just before the final race weekend of the year.
I thought this was a known thing, but I guess not.
Never known about that.
You've never cared. I see how it is.
I can't read.
Well,
so how would I know about that?
That's a good point. Gustav also says, what are your guys' thoughts about our Swedish talents on the road to Indy? He also says, hey, Oliver Askew is half Swedish. And obviously Rasmus Lind, who we've spoken about, also says, hashtag me personally, love the podcast. Can't wait for the final race. Thanks, Gustav. So we've spoken about Askew. I'm not sure if the American half or the Swedish half has been the fast part. Maybe it's been the unique brew of both things coming together. Love that his sponsor as well, right, is a Swedish one, or Swedish angle as well there. Spoken about Rasmus, let's speak some words about Marcus Ericsson, Felix Rosenqvist. How, coming into the season finale here at Monterey, Monsieur Krohn, what are your feelings on their respective seasons? Have both lived up to expectations? One more, one less?
Well, I think
I'm trying to get you fired, by the way, by trying to get you to say some bad things.
It's been obviously a little bit of up and down for both of them, but I think for Felix, I think he's really started coming into his own now. I think he, I read an article earlier today. I can't remember if it was you that wrote it or whatever, but he was just saying that he was pushing way too hard in the early part of the season, trying to be P1 every single session.
Yep.
And now he sort of understood, okay, what makes Scott Dixon great is he knows exactly when to push. He knows exactly when to hold back. And that's what he started learning now. So I think coming into next year, I think we're going to see Felix Rosenqvist, that is firing on all cylinders and knowing that a lot more. And for Marcus, man, I feel a bit bad for him because I think if you look at some of the races he's put together, had it not been for the tiniest of mistakes, he would have been, I think, top 10 in just about every single one of his oval outings this year. He was, running well inside the top 10 at the 500, then made a small mistake entering pit lane. Similar story at Iowa. It's just been kind of one of those years where, with the exception of Detroit, whenever he's had a good run going, some little mistake has kept him from capitalizing on it. So I think that's sort of masked a little bit, really how strong he's been, because he's had some bad luck and some bad execution in qualifyings, but then, is charged to the front in the races and then something's happened. So I honestly feel like both of them have shown a lot of potential, and it's just a matter of, if they come back next year, can they, can they capitalize on that and can they, remove those small mistakes that have taken them out of contention in a few of the races.
Well, to my knowledge, Felix is going nowhere because he's got a contract, and you don't want to be hunted down by Chip Ganassi. That's a bad thing. I've been impressed with Marcus's mindset, even though this year has not gone according to plan necessarily. His passion for wanting to do this, that is what has impressed me. What do you think about this? We're talking about the different year the two have had. Chip Ganassi Racing, we know, is a different animal than Aeroschmidt-Peterson. Aero SPM is trying to become like a Ganassi or an Andretti, part of the top three. Not there yet, but one thing that I think has really benefited Felix, if you agree or maybe don't, that Marcus has not had, is a benefit of a Dario Franchitti type. So with Aero SPM, they have an amazing driver coach in Bob Perona. So that has been a great asset. But just in terms of that Rick Mears type at Team Penske, Allenser Jr. at Harding Steinbrenner Racing, and Dario here again working so directly with Felix, definitely seems like Marcus might have benefited from having a veteran driver, not so much driving coach, but hey, I'm going to work with you and get you ready and coach you up in all the areas that aren't necessarily just about turning the wheel and stomping on the pedals. Do you think that might be an area that Felix has maybe had a little bit of extra help that could have benefited Marcus?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all, but I also think just his benefit of being able to look at everything Scott Dixon's doing, because I think somehow, some way, Scott Dixon appears to be his own best driver coach, and he's always able to extract the maximum. So I certainly think between the two of them, I mean, how many IndyCar championships and 500 wins do they have? I mean, that's a huge resource to be able to pull from. So I know he values that very, very highly, and will no doubt have helped. But I think, I do think that he also just, to me, has a really good feel for this car. And I think what's also really helped him is the fact that he's driven some lower downforce cars in the last few years, the Formula E car, which basically had zero grip.
Yeah.
He's driven a lot of GT cars, and I think this aero kit probably drives quite a bit differently to, an F1 car that's stuck to the ground. And so I think the transition for him, driving style wise, has probably been a bit easier than that of Marcus. And then it's more for Felix been a matter of, okay, I have actually just got to tone it down a bit because I've been over pushing a bit. So that to me probably is a contributing factor in addition to what you said. Yeah.
Two more questions to close. This comes in from our man Mike Stoops. Mike, thanks for always sending in fun stuff here on the good old Week in IndyCar. He says, Anders, I've really enjoyed your work on NBC Sports Gold. Hey, that makes one of us. He says, it seems Indy Lights has done everything it can to contain costs, yet the field remains small and even shrunk by one car. Portland, do you think the series is still too expensive, or is the issue something else?
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up. I was actually having that very conversation. I forget with whom the other day, and we were talking about the value proposition. And I feel like a couple of years ago, was the value proposition there? No, it was too high. But they've done a great job of bringing the budgets down. I mean, now I'm hearing somewhere in the range of $850 to $900 for a season. And when you take inflation into the matter, I mean, that's the exact same dollar figure that was a competitive budget back when I was doing it in 2011. And so with inflation, you would think that would very easily be 1.2, 1.3 million by now. So to me, I think that the value is absolutely there. And I'm just not sure if it's because it's such a saturated marketplace right now with sports cars have become very, very much more popular over the last few years. There's a lot more options for people to get into prototypes and the GT cars. So I think realistically think that's the only thing I can think of in my head is that people at a younger age are making the switch to sports cars, whereas before it was sort of you have to follow the entire open wheel ladder to Indy Lights, and then at that time, if you don't make it to IndyCar, then you make the switch to sports cars. Whereas now it's more like after USF 2000, you feel like already, okay, I've already got options now. So to be completely honest, that is the only logical thing I can think of, because I feel like the value proposition is actually pretty incredible. 10 race weekends, you race with IndyCar for the entire year, good coverage, good crowds, everything is there. And yet to your point, yeah, the grids maintain relatively small. So I'm hoping that there's a turning point, because I think that the racing has been phenomenal. 25 out of the 33 drivers on the Indy 500 grid this year had done Indy Lights. I mean, it works. it clearly works. So it's just a matter of more people kind of committing to that route, I think.
I just took a look. In 1996, our Genoa Racing Indy Lights team, where we ran Mark Hotchkiss and Dave De Silva, they each spent a little bit different. De Silva spent a little bit more, or had more hospitality and a few other bells and whistles. And if I remember correctly, Mark spent about $800,000 and De Silva spent about $900,000. And just doing the inflation correction for that, it's about 1.36, almost 1.4 million in today's dollars. So while numerically it might be, $850 back then to $850 today might be the same number, in reality, these guys were spending the better part of 1.3 to 1.4 million for a season, and we did things on a fairly lean way. Keep in mind, this is going up against full cigarette tobacco players team, cool team, lot of money being spent, and I believe there were 12 races back then, but the cars were just dumb as rocks. I mean, it was a repurposed Lola F3000 chassis and a 4.2-liter, 7,000-pound cast iron Buick V6. I mean, like these things were used in war to just throw them at the enemy. I mean, there's no bomb that could do more damage than having one of those things dropped on you. So anyways, just interesting to see that the number today is as low as it is. Maybe the take-home thing, though, here, Mike, is that even though Indy Lights and Dallara and AER and Cooper Tires have all worked together to bring the number down, the marketplace dictates, as we know, right, Anders, whether they've brought it. They might take 25% of the annual budget. Well, I go, that's amazing. If folks still aren't signing up, the market's telling us, at least for what people are willing to spend, there's still some more changes that need to happen. Well, let's go to the final question, and I saved it for last because it's very fitting. Frankly, it's how we started the show here with you. This comes in from our man, Steve Straub, who says, Anders, where do you get your happy pills from, and how much do they cost? He says, you are one of the most entertaining announcers, and your enthusiasm is infectious. Steve goes on to say, congrats on another terrific season of Indy Lights broadcasts on NBC Sports. He also asks, and this was responded to by the Indy Lights series, will we see you as a full-time IndyCar broadcaster someday?
Well, man, that's thank you so much. I'm almost lost for words. I mean, happy pills, I don't know that I really take them, but maybe my wife slips me something every morning or every night that I'm not aware of.
Those Blue Chew pills? Yes, I believe so. I believe so.
So maybe she has something to do with it. But honestly, I think it's just, I mean, I'm passionate about it. I've loved this sport since I can remember. And, to get to talk about it is just fantastic. I mean, it's difficult to call it a job. So, I mean, I think for me, it's just, hey, I get to talk about something that I love, and I get to share with my knowledge with people that may not have so much knowledge. And for me, it's fantastic to be able to pass that on. So I think that's where the happiness comes from anyway. And as for your other question, I have no idea. Time will tell. We shall see, but I'm eternally grateful for the opportunities that I have been given, because it really, I think back to 2013 when the IndyCar radio crew asked me into the booth for one Indy Lights race, and the following year I had a call with NBC asking if I wanted to do a full season for them, and of course I had no idea what this meant, but I said yes, and here I am 6 years later. So I feel like for someone with zero background, or until I was in it, I didn't know that I had a desire to do it. I've loved every minute of it, and eternally grateful for every opportunity I've been given. So yeah, if the road stopped today, I would be incredibly grateful. But if it continued for another 20 years, I'd be happy with that as well.
I love the fact that you sent in your question, Steve, and the Indy Lights folks responded on Twitter regarding his becoming a full-time IndyCar broadcaster with a very polite heck no. And I actually thought of that, Anders, and I just love the irony in that when I think of the road to Indy, I think of the advancement prizes. This might be the first time they hand out an anti-advancement prize where they say, no, you're good and we won't let you go. You have to stay here. So maybe that's a bit of a nice little nod themselves. All right. Well, I know you're busy because you have spent half your day trying to schedule things with me, and I've failed in every capacity there.
I have failed miserably, so I apologize.
That's all good. I'm just going to get IndyCar to cancel the sessions leading up to the race. Then we'll have plenty of time for the things we're trying to schedule. All that nonsense aside, truly always a pleasure to have you on the show here, and you know how much I appreciate you and the good work that you do in the paddock, my man. So thanks for helping coach us up for the Road to Indy season finales this weekend at WeatherTech Raceway, Laguna Seca. Going to be some kids earning the advancement prizes you can't have, apparently, and moving their way up, hopefully, to become stars of the future here. Thanks, brother, and I look forward to seeing you here in a day or two.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, MP. I'll talk to you soon.